May 2022, we released a video that demonstrated that the Russia-Ukraine conflict was not some unique and arbitrary event, but was in fact just another step in a continuous and ever-evolving plan that is constantly transferring money from the taxpayers of the Western democratic nations to the globalist leaders of the New World Order. The invasion of Syria, not only by an Islamist group headed by the former Al-Qaeda member Abu Mohammed al-Julani, but also by Israel. This is the latest step of the continuous process. But this process had been threatened by this man, Mr. Donald Trump. Mr. Trump wanted a peaceful end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That threatened globalist profits. Another war needed to be started. But how could a new war be started? A reason, an excuse was needed. That excuse may well have been planned to occur 7 October 2023. On that day, Hamas attacked Israel. Civilians at a music festival were killed and others taken hostage. Targets within Israel were attacked. But all this raised an enormous question. Just how did Hamas breach Israel's security? How were they given so much time to round up hostages and escape back to Gaza before Israel responded? Could it be that this attack was planned to trigger the events that have occurred since and now includes the invasion of Syria? Before pursuing that point, we return to a clip of 11 minutes length taken from our original video that explains the globalist background, names the organizations involved, and details the processes used to control national governments. The current situation in Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Iran, and Israel is then resumed. This channel strongly argues that it is the West in particular that is at war with a chaotic form of globalism that is seeking to replace national democracy and liberty with a global autocracy. One continuous and ever-increasing trend which happens in front of our very eyes practically every day is the transfer of money from the taxpayers of democratic nations to the globalist leaders of the New World Order. The leaders of globalism being the trillion-dollar global corporations, the trillion-dollar military-industrial complex, the billion-dollar foundations, royalty, and the super-rich. This video will specifically highlight the transfer of money from the taxpayers of democratic nations to the military-industrial complex. We will do so with the help of the 34th United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower. But first, we will pick up a theme from a previous video that connected the leaders of the New World Order to issues such as climate change and COVID-19, and to global organizations such as the United Nations, World Health Organization, and the World Economic Forum. The video noted that over the previous 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, the leaders of globalism and the New World Order had increased their wealth enormously. Pfizer had set new record levels of revenue. Those with large shareholdings in pharmaceutical companies producing COVID-19 vaccines also profited. Foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation profited. In fact, this foundation had made a $200 billion profit on vaccines prior to 2019. So now, with the COVID-19 vaccines and its connections with, even control of, the World Health Organization, the sky was the limit. As to the super rich and royalty, the fortunes of the 10 richest men in the world more than doubled during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Their combined fortunes were worth $700 billion before the pandemic, but are now worth a combined $1.5 trillion. But the video noted it appeared that the military-industrial complex had not benefited over the past 2 years and had even suffered. Leading up to 2021, the military-industrial complex had been making billions of US dollars in revenue over the previous 20 years. The United States had provided an estimated $83 billion US dollars worth of military aid, including training and equipment, to Afghan security forces since 2001, during the war in Afghanistan. In 2021 alone, the US military aid to Afghan forces was $3 billion US dollars. Of course, that stopped in August 2021 when the US military departed Afghanistan. At that point, the revenue streams of the military-industrial complex dried up. Our previous video noted this loss of revenue to the military-industrial complex, but also identified a potential new opportunity. The Russia-Ukraine conflict. Being proven right took a lot less time than we anticipated. While Israel plans to increase military aid to Ukraine, the US President Joe Biden has urged Congress to pass his $33 billion US dollar aid package to Ukraine. This is a staggering amount of money and is around 1/3 of the total of military aid sent to Afghanistan over 20 years. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, while describing Ukraine's defence as its finest hour, also confirmed more aid to the tune of £300 million. Then, in the first week of May, he announced a £1.3 billion of further military support to Ukraine. We now come to the point. Various terms have been used: aid, military support. This is in fact the transfer of money from the taxpayers of democratic nations to the military-industrial complex, some of which may well be laundered to its many supporting governmental puppets. Some of what has been just claimed may shock you, but it really shouldn't. This has been going on for many years. This channel has previously asserted that much of the globalist New World Order is already in place and has been in place for decades at the very least. We turn to Dwight Eisenhower to back up our assertion. More than 80 years ago, he was warning of the military-industrial complex and the transfer of wealth to it from the taxpayers of the United States. He warned that the more money spent on the military meant less money spent on Americans. The transfer of wealth, he said, from the people to the military-industrial complex entailed that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed, and that this world in arms is not spending money alone, it is spending the sweat of its labourers, the hopes of its children. So, more than 80 years ago, we were warned of the transfer of money from the taxpayers of democratic nations to the military-industrial complex. But the scope of the money transfer is currently much wider. Over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have paid out huge amounts of taxpayer money for PCR tests. Absolutely staggering sums have been paid by governments for vaccines and the so-called boosters, similarly for masks and sanitizers. While at the same time, economies have suffered and the cost of living has drastically increased. And the damage to children and their long-term health and education is impossible to calculate at this time. But the net result has been the transfer of money from the taxpayers of democratic nations to the globalist leaders of the New World Order and their cronies. But as the advice of ex-President Eisenhower clearly demonstrates, this is not new. Much of the globalist New World Order is already in place. Globalists created organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, United Nations, WHO, and the World Economic Forum. They then saw to it that sympathetic individuals would be appointed as heads of these organizations. Governments are groomed over long periods, appointed and then controlled. In one way or another, social media and mainstream media are owned by globalists. This can be through direct ownership or bribes in the form of advertising revenues, etc. The World Economic Forum was formed by globalists in 1971, and a willing young man, Klaus Schwab, was installed as its head. But these are the real leaders of globalism and the New World Order. Sometimes there will be conflicts of interests, and that is why globalism often loses its structure and becomes dangerously chaotic. But the same generic method is always used, and is being used now in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Servile puppets are appointed as leaders of global organizations. Further puppets are installed in national governments. A global problem is created from which the globalists stand to profit. The controlled global organizations set the agenda on how to fix the problem. Huge drama and urgency is created by biased mainstream media coverage. Then the globalists pull the strings on their obedient puppets as and when required. The longer the problem lasts, the more money that can be transferred. This explains the enthusiasm of, for example, Boris Johnson, to keep the conflict going for as long as possible, no matter what the consequences are for the people of Ukraine and Russia. We must now face reality. The governments of the West are weak and are being controlled. It is up to the citizens of the Western nations to defeat this globalist movement. That ends the clip from a previous video. The message does not change, but to return to the current situation, December 2024. Despite good, but not conclusive, evidence that many will still doubt whether the Hamas attack on Israel, 7 October 2023, was backed and planned by factions supporting globalist interests, and particularly the interests of the military-industrial complex. It is in the interest of both to have continuous and escalating wars, and the events following 7 October 2023 support that thesis. Civilians are still dying in Gaza. Syria is being invaded by various factions that include Israel and Turkey. Israel is striking military sites in Syria and has moved into the Golan Heights buffer zone. Benjamin Netanyahu says the Golan Heights will remain part of Israel for eternity. All of this happened in just a blink of an eye after President Assad fled Syria. It must have been previously planned, with all the required military infrastructure already in place. Meanwhile, there is a threat of war in Europe. The elections in Romania was annulled because the predicted outcome did not suit the globalists and the globalist puppets in the EU. Within days, over 1 million Romanians backed a petition that demanded a return of national democracy. The globalist EU is signalling its alarm at the protests taking place in Georgia. Civil wars in Europe are a possibility. You may ask, just what is the United Nations doing at this time? In the previous video clip, the UN was identified as a globalist organization that does not support the best interest of national democratic governments. Whatever your views, it cannot be argued that the United Nations is not a bloated, bureaucratic, and tragically failed organization. Each day of each year, it fails to deliver the primary purpose of its charter, which is to maintain international peace and security. What is it doing about Syria? The UN Secretary General says that he is sending a special envoy to Syria to help them. Our previous summary is repeated. We must now face reality. The governments of the West are weak and are being controlled. It is up to the citizens of the Western nations to defeat this globalist movement.